In the summer of 1942, on Long Island, New York, engineers at the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation were working late into the evening. The air was thick with the smell of oil and metal shavings, and the factory floors hummed with a quiet, determined energy. They were designing a fighter plane, but not just any fighter. This one had to be different. It had to be tougher. The United States Navy had learned hard lessons in the early days of the Pacific War. The Japanese A6M0 was light, agile, and deadly in a dogfight. American pilots flying the F4F Wildcat, Grumman's earlier design, had courage, but their planes were outmatched in speed and maneuverability. Something new was needed. Something that could take punishment, climb higher, and bring pilots home. And so, the Hellcat was born. Grumman's engineers didn't try to outturn the Zero. Instead, they built a plane that could outmuscle it. The F6F was heavier, more powerful. Its engine, a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, rumbled with 2,000 horsepower. That engine sat in the nose like a beating heart, reliable and strong. The cockpit was set high on the fuselage, giving the pilot excellent visibility. He could see the horizon, the clouds, the enemy. The wings were thick and sturdy, capable of carrying 6.50 caliber machine guns, 3 on each side. Later models could carry rockets and bombs as well. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, meaning that if a bullet pierced them, a rubber lining would swell and close the hole. Small details, but they saved lives. By early 1943, the first Hellcats were rolling off the assembly line. Workers, many of them women, riveted the aluminum skin onto the frame, piece by piece. They painted the planes in dark sea blue, a color that blended with the sky and sea. Each plane carried the white star of the United States, a symbol of hope in the vast Pacific theater. The Navy pilots who first flew the Hellcat noticed something immediately. It felt solid. It didn't dance through the air like the Zero, but it didn't need to. It climbed steadily. It dove with authority. And when you pulled the trigger, those 6 guns roared in unison, a sound like thunder rolling across the sky. Test pilots took the Hellcat up over the Atlantic, pushing it through rolls and dives, and it responded smoothly, predictably. There was a reassurance in that. A pilot could trust this machine. And in war, trust was everything. By mid-1943, the first squadrons were forming. Young men, many just out of flight school, were learning to fly the Hellcat. They practiced carrier landings, the most dangerous part of naval aviation. The plane's wide landing gear gave it stability on the deck, and the tail hook caught the arresting wire with satisfying certainty. Again and again, they practiced, until it became second nature. And soon, very soon, they would take those skills into combat. Somewhere in a hangar on a carrier in the Pacific, a mechanic wiped down the cowling of a freshly serviced Hellcat. The metal gleamed faintly in the dim light. Outside, the ocean rolled gently under the stars, and the ship rocked in a slow, steady rhythm. Everything was ready. And in the background, the distant hum of the ship's engines, a lullaby of preparation. The first major test of the Hellcat came in the fall of 1943. Over the Gilbert Islands. The sky was a pale, tropical blue, the kind that seems endless. American carriers had steamed into position, and now, the air wings were launching. One by one, the Hellcats roared down the flight deck, their engines growling as they lifted into the sky. The pilots felt the familiar lurch as the plane left the deck, and then, the smooth glide as they climbed. Below, the ocean stretched out, a vast expanse of blue and white. The mission was simple: escort the bombers, protect them from Japanese fighters. But simple didn't mean easy. As the formation flew toward the target, the radio crackled. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high!" The pilots scanned the sky, and there they were. Zeros. Small, nimble, closing fast. The Hellcat pilots didn't panic. They'd been trained for this. Instead of turning to meet the Zeros head-on, they climbed. The Hellcat's powerful engine gave them an advantage in vertical maneuvers. Climb, dive, repeat. Don't get drawn into a slow-turning fight. Use your strengths. A Zero peeled off and dove toward one of the American planes. The Hellcat pilot saw him coming, and instead of turning away, he pushed the throttle forward and dove as well. The Hellcat was faster in a dive. The Zero couldn't keep up. The American pilot pulled up sharply, the G-forces pressing him into his seat, and when he leveled out, the Zero was below him. He rolled inverted, dove again, and opened fire. The 6 machine guns stitched a line across the Zero's fuselage. The lightweight Japanese fighter shuddered, and pieces of metal fluttered away like leaves. Smoke began to trail from the engine. The Zero rolled once, twice, and then spiraled down toward the ocean below. The Hellcat pilot didn't celebrate. There were more Zeros, and the fight wasn't over. He rejoined his wingman, and together they climbed back into the fray. This pattern repeated across the Pacific in the months that followed. The Hellcat wasn't faster in level flight than the Zero, and it couldn't turn as tightly. But it was faster in a dive. It could take more damage, and it had more firepower. American pilots learned to fight to those strengths. Climb, dive, shoot, climb again. Never get slow. Never try to outturn a Zero. Japanese pilots, who had dominated the skies in 1941 and 1942, began to find themselves at a disadvantage. The Hellcat was forgiving. It gave its pilots a second chance. The Zero, for all its grace, was fragile. A few hits could cripple it. And the Hellcat's 6 guns delivered those hits with devastating efficiency. By early 1944, the Hellcat had become the backbone of the Navy's fighter force. It flew from carriers across the Pacific, from the Marshalls to the Marianas to the Philippines. Pilots painted small Japanese flags on the sides of their planes, one for each kill. Some planes had rows of them. The Hellcat didn't demand perfection from its pilots. It was stable, reliable, and strong. It brought them home. And in the vast, lonely skies of the Pacific, that mattered more than anything. On a carrier deck at dusk, a Hellcat sat quietly, its propeller still. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A sailor walked past, trailing his hand along the wing. The metal was warm from the day's missions. Everything was peaceful now. And in the distance, the soft sound of waves against the hull. June 19, 1944. Dawned clear and warm over the Philippine Sea. The American carrier fleet, Task Force 58, stretched across the ocean, 15 carriers in all, each one a floating city. On the flight decks, hundreds of Hellcats waited, their wings folded upward to save space. Pilots sat in ready rooms below, playing cards, writing letters, waiting. They didn't know it yet, but this day would become legendary. The Japanese fleet was approaching. They had launched a massive strike, hundreds of aircraft, hoping to cripple the American carriers in one decisive blow. But the Japanese pilots were not the veterans of 1941. Many were new, hastily trained. Fuel shortages and combat losses had thinned the ranks of the experienced flyers. They were brave, but bravery alone wasn't enough. The radar screens on the American ships began to light up. Contacts, lots of them. The alarm went up. Pilots scrambled. Within minutes, the Hellcats were launching. The flight decks roared with activity, plane after plane lifting into the sky. Hundreds of Hellcats formed up, layer upon layer, stacked at different altitudes. They climbed to meet the incoming Japanese formations. The sky was so full of planes that it seemed impossible to sort them out, but the Hellcat pilots had practiced this. They knew their jobs. The first contact came at high altitude. The Japanese bombers, escorted by Zeros, flew in tight formations. The Hellcat pilots dove through them, slashing attacks, guns blazing. The Japanese formations broke apart, bombers scattering. Zeros trying desperately to protect them. But there were too many Hellcats. Everywhere a Zero turned, there was another American fighter. The Hellcat pilots worked in pairs. One would draw the Zero's attention, the other would swing around and attack from behind. Teamwork. Discipline. Training. One after another, Japanese planes fell from the sky. Some spun down trailing smoke. Others exploded in midair, brief orange fireballs against the blue. A few managed to reach the American fleet, but the anti-aircraft fire was intense, and the Hellcats followed them all the way in. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost more than 300 aircraft. American losses were fewer than 30. Pilots returned to their carriers, fuel gauges hovering near empty, but grinning. Some had scored multiple kills in a single mission. The deck crews painted new victory flags on the fuselages. The Navy sailors began calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name stuck. It wasn't meant to glorify the killing, but to express the lopsided nature of the battle. The Hellcat had proven itself decisively. In the aftermath, Japanese naval aviation never fully recovered. The carriers still sailed, but they had few trained pilots left. The Hellcat, and the men who flew it, had broken the back of Japanese air power in the Pacific. That evening, after the battle, the carriers steamed quietly westward. The sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the decks. Mechanics worked through the night, patching bullet holes, refueling planes, loading ammunition. The Hellcats sat in neat rows, waiting for the next mission. One pilot, exhausted, sat on the wing of his plane and looked out at the ocean. The water was calm. The stars were beginning to appear. He thought about the men who hadn't come back, both American and Japanese. War was strange that way. You fought hard, and then it was quiet again. He climbed down, walked slowly to his bunk, and fell asleep to the gentle rocking of the ship. And somewhere in the distance, the soft sound of the ocean, eternal and patient. Life aboard a carrier in the Pacific was a rhythm, a cycle of routine and danger. The Hellcat was at the center of it all. Pilots lived with their planes, depended on them, and the ground crews treated each aircraft like a living thing. Before dawn each day, the flight deck came alive. Sailors in color-coded jerseys, each color representing a different job, swarmed over the planes. The yellow shirts directed the planes as they were moved into position. The red shirts handled the bombs and ammunition. The brown shirts, the plane captains, oversaw everything, making sure their assigned aircraft was ready. The Hellcat required constant care. Salt air corroded metal. The powerful engine needed frequent maintenance. Oil levels had to be checked. Spark plugs replaced. The guns cleaned and tested. Every rivet, every panel, inspected. A plane captain might spend an hour just wiping down the canopy, making sure the pilot had clear visibility. Small things, but they mattered. A smudge at the wrong moment could mean the difference between spotting an enemy or being caught off guard. The pilots themselves followed their own routines. Breakfast in the wardroom, usually eggs and coffee. Then a briefing. The intelligence officer would point to maps, describe the target, note the expected enemy resistance. The pilots listened quietly, nodding, asking questions. Then, the walk to the flight deck. The roar of wind. The smell of aviation fuel and exhaust. Each pilot climbed into his cockpit, settled into the seat, adjusted the straps. The plane captain would stand on the wing, helping with the harness, making sure everything was secure. A thumbs up. The engine coughed, coughed again, then roared to life. The propeller became a blur. The plane shook with restrained power. One by one, the Hellcats taxied to the catapult or the launch spot. The deck officer raised his hand, held it, then dropped it sharply. The plane surged forward, racing down the deck, and then lifted. The ocean dropped away. The plane climbed into the sky. Hours might pass. The pilots flew in formation, sometimes in complete silence, just the hum of the engine and the whistle of wind. They scanned the horizon, watched the clouds, stayed alert. When they returned, landing on a carrier was always tense. The deck looked impossibly small from the air. The pilot had to judge his speed, his angle, perfectly. Too fast, and he'd miss the arresting wire. Too slow, and he'd stall and crash. But the Hellcat was forgiving. Its wide landing gear and stable flight characteristics made it easier than most. The hook caught the wire with a jolt. The plane jerked to a stop. The pilot exhaled. Another mission done. Evenings were quieter. Pilots gathered in the ready room, playing cards, listening to music on a crackling radio. They wrote letters home, though they couldn't say much. Censorship rules were strict. "I'm doing fine. The weather is nice. I miss you." That was about it. The Hellcat sat on the deck, secured with chains. The moon rose over the ocean, casting silver light across the water. The ship rocked gently. Somewhere below, in the engine room, machinery hummed. But on the flight deck, it was peaceful. A sailor on watch leaned against the Hellcat's fuselage. The metal was cool now. He looked up at the stars, so many of them, scattered across the black sky like dust. He thought about home. About the war. About how much longer it might last. But for now, there was just this moment. The quiet. The stars. The steady breathing of the ship beneath him. And far below, the whisper of the ocean, rolling endlessly on. By the summer of 1945, the war in the Pacific was nearing its end. The Hellcat had flown thousands of missions, from the Gilberts to Okinawa. It had escorted bombers, strafed ground targets, shot down enemy aircraft by the hundreds. Pilots trusted it. Crews loved it. And the Japanese had learned to respect it. In total, the F6F Hellcat was credited with destroying more than 5,000 enemy aircraft. That's more than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific. It had a kill ratio of 19-1. Meaning for every Hellcat lost in combat, 19 enemy planes were shot down. Those numbers tell a story of engineering, training, and courage. But the Hellcat's story wasn't just about numbers. It was about the men who flew it. Young men, many still in their early 20s, who climbed into the cockpit day after day. Some became aces, shooting down 5 or more enemy planes. Others flew dozens of missions without ever firing a shot in anger, but their presence in the sky, their willingness to be there, mattered just as much. One pilot, in a letter home, wrote, "The Hellcat isn't fancy, but it brings you back." That sentiment was common. The plane wasn't beautiful. It didn't have the sleek lines of a P-51 Mustang or the raw power of a Corsair. But it was dependable. Solid. Honest. When the war ended in August 1945, the Hellcats kept flying for a while. They flew patrols over occupied Japan. They escorted transport planes carrying POWs home. And then, gradually, they were retired. Many were scrapped, cut up for metal. Some were sold to Allied nations. France, Argentina, Uruguay. A few ended up as museum pieces, preserved as reminders of what had been. Today, if you visit the right museums, you can still see a Hellcat. The paint is often faded, the metal dulled by time. But stand close, and you can still sense what it was. Run your hand along the wing. Look into the cockpit. Imagine the young man who sat there, scanning the sky, far from home. The Hellcat represented something important. It was a machine built with purpose. Not for show, not for spectacle, but to do a job. And it did that job well. It protected carriers. It cleared the skies. It brought pilots home. The men who flew the Hellcat grew old, and most have passed on now. But they remembered. At reunions, they would talk about their planes. They'd run their hands over photographs, point to details, tell stories. "That's my plane," they'd say. "That's the one that got me through." There's a certain beauty in that. Not in the war, but in the bond between man and machine. The trust. The reliance. The gratitude. On a quiet airfield somewhere, an old Hellcat sits in a hangar. It's been restored, painted in the colors it wore in 1944. Sometimes, on special occasions, it's rolled out and started up. The engine coughs, sputters, then roars. People gather to watch. The sound is incredible, deep and powerful. And for a moment, it's 1944 again. But then the engine shuts down. The propeller stops. And the silence returns. The Hellcat's war is over. Its pilots have gone. But the memory remains. A reminder of a time when young men took to the skies in sturdy planes, and did what was asked of them. And now, as you drift towards sleep, let that image rest with you. The Hellcat, wings folded, resting on a quiet deck under the stars. Good night. And so, we come to the end of our story tonight. The F6F Hellcat, a plane built not for glory, but for purpose. It did its job well, and brought its pilots home. Let that thought carry you into rest now. The war is over, the skies are quiet, and you are safe. Sleep well, and we'll meet again soon, with another story from the past. Good night.